So there's people here. This is exciting.
Hi,
So,
everyone.
hi. I'm Jeanne Bowerman,
And I'm Ciara Duggan.
and you are listening to The Story Will Save You. So, welcome to our discussion about turning your script into a novel. And first, Ciara, do you want to introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Ciara. I am a creative executive at Book Pipeline. I originally got my MFA in screenwriting from Boston University. And then after that, I got much more into novel writing. And I've since published 2 books and a short story with a couple independent presses. And I'm still writing and loving it. And haven't really gone back to screenwriting because I love novel writing so much. So, and I work at Book Pipeline. So, yeah, it's great. How
Sweet.
about you, Jeannie?
So I am Jeanne Bowerman. I am a senior executive at Pipeline Media Group, which you guys might recognize: Script Pipeline, Book Pipeline, Film Pipeline. I run Pipeline Artists, which is our content site, which is a beautiful site. And if you ever want to pitch me articles, feel free. And I also run Symposium, which is our online, it's like our online conference of the arts, year-round conference. We are going to keep this very informal. We want you guys to participate. You guys have questions, we'll answer them and talk about them along the way. Following Ciara's lead about my writing path, I used to be the editor-in-chief of Script Magazine, and I wrote screenplays and many and pitched a lot of places and had a great time in that space. But now I'm writing a novel and I am very much loving it. So Ciara and I are hoping to bring forth our thoughts about, especially writing that first novel if you've never done it. And if you want to take that script that you already have and adapt it. So Ciara, I want to ask you, when you, because
Yes.
you did go to school for screenwriting. So what was it that made you say, I want to write a script, and a book, and that first book that you wrote, was it one of your screenplays?
It wasn't one of my screenplays because it was a young adult fantasy that I threw everything in the kitchen sink into it. And so if it were one of my screenplays at school, they would have been like, what the heck is this? Cut, 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 cut. I think after I was so into screenwriting, I just kind of craved longer form. And not to say that screenplays aren't long form, but there's a lot more freedom to get more descriptive, to have subplots, just to explore the world a little bit more. So that is kind of just what I started doing, and I just found it very liberating. But I will say that first book I wrote after kind of departing from screenwriting a little bit was riddled with kind of faux pas of in the fiction realm where I think I let the freedom get to my head a bit. And I just had way too many subplots, way too many characters. I would depart the main plot entirely and spend 2 or 3 chapters somewhere else. And I remember getting feedback being like, what does this have to do with like the main story? How is it moving it forward? And I just had this moment where I was like, yeah, I think I just like had a lot of fun with this. And basically what I'm trying to say, going forward after writing that first novel, I returned closer to my screenwriting roots where I stayed very close to kind of that tighter narrative, making sure every single scene moves the story forward or somehow significantly develops the character. You still have more freedom though. So
A lot more freedom. And I also want curious if people can put in the chat if you've ever attempted a novel before, because I'm curious of how many of you have ever tried, assuming that this group is all screenwriters. And for me, I wrote a practice novel, and it was not something that I had written in a screenplay form either, which was really fun and exciting. But I did try to use all those screenwriting rules of advancing the story and keeping it succinct and all of that kind of stuff. And there's so much about that we learn as screenwriters that really translates well into novel writing. I feel like now today's audience has such a short attention span that they really want to feel like, when screenwriting, when we say a fast read, I feel like they still want that in a novel. They want to be able to sit down and read it in a weekend or like, so I think there's a lot of advantage and that we know how to write visually and we know rules of story. And I've always maintained if you have a script that you think would make a good book, why not adapt it? Because you already have the structure. It's like a treatment for a book,
Right.
I mean, why not just elaborate?
I think another reason kind of why I was so attracted to moving into fiction and away from screenwriting was I just felt the industry in general felt a little more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
It felt really difficult to get your screenplay in front of people in the film and television industry, whereas in publishing, it's still difficult. Don't get me wrong, but the querying process, I find that agents actually read your work for the most part. You can get some feedback, and I just found it much more accessible than the screenwriting industry. So for me, it was a bit of a breath of fresh air in that regard. And kind of going off what you said is like if you're having difficulty getting your screenplay or your story out there in screenplay form, who knows? It could get discovered first as a novel and then be adapted to the screen. So you never know.
Right. And the beautiful thing is if you adapt one of your scripts into a novel, you already have the script. So if you go to try to sell the film rights, oh, I already have a screenplay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the beautiful of it. So what did you find? This is like I'm interviewing you, Ciara. What did you find the most challenging thing when you made that switch? Like beyond what you already talked about, like maybe getting a little too free with what you were writing, but what did you find challenging?
I think it was kind of finding that balance between providing description that made it a visual experience for the reader on the page while they're reading your book, but not going overboard into, having too flowery of language. I mean, it's so subjective. I know some people love the overly descriptive prose, but for me, and for I feel like most mainstream books, people prefer a quick pace and they nearly don't even want to notice. Some people, not saying everyone, don't even want to notice kind of the words on the page. You just want to be so pulled into the story
Mm.
that it's more of an experience. So for me, it was kind of balancing like I still need to expand onto the page and get this to be book form, but not kind of get too overboard with unnecessary descriptors. I think that was challenging for me.
Even, I mean, think about when you read a book, like some of the greatest books I've read, you don't notice the writing, but then every once in a while, there's a sentence that makes you go, oh, I wish I wrote that. Like, and that's all you need. Like, you don't have to focus. Like, every sentence doesn't have to be this incredible piece of prose. Sprinkle a few in outstanding sentences throughout the story, and that's all you really need. Like I know even when we're judging for our unpublished contest and we're reading all the book submissions, when somebody gets like too flowery with the prose, it pulls me out. It feels like, they're just, and even when I'm reading a best-selling book, sometimes it feels like they tried too hard. Like just relax, like it's just tell the story. That's really what people like.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in some of those books that we read, and while we're judging, we say, wow, this would make a great movie. I find that those are the pros that just kind of pull you in and you're on this ride through the scene and through every chapter. I feel like that kind of actually gives screenwriters a bit of a leg up because we're used to having to be a bit more succinct and visual and pulling the reader into a scene so they can see it. And I think that translates really well when trying to write a novel.
Screenwriters, one of the biggest things that they struggle with is letting loose, getting more words on the page. That first draft. So when you guys go and you try this, your first draft is probably going to be like way too short and you're going to have to build it up. But I think the other thing that screenwriters struggle with is figuring out which point of view you're going to tell the story. And I'm speaking about whether you're going to write it in first person. I don't think anybody writes in second person, but third person. third person omniscient. Like there's all these different things that as screenwriters, we always write in the third person. So when
And
you have
tense
to,
as well.
yes, and tense. So those are things that like you don't even think about. You just start writing, and then all of a sudden you'll give it to somebody to read and they'll say, oh, well, you're head hopping. And you're like, well,
Mm,
what does that even mean? So
right.
there's a lot of craft that's the same, but some craft that's different.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always a struggle, I think, figuring out which point of view. I will tell you one of the best pieces of advice is that pieces of advice that I recently, jeez, I can't talk today. For us, it's nighttime,
Yeah, it's
people.
late
So
over here.
um, I was reading something that had lots of different points of view, characters. I was like, how do they get away with this? Because you usually hear, don't do that. Don't be in the heads of like 5, 6 different characters. Well, it's Ken Follett, and he is an author, and he basically said the trick is if you're going to use multiple different people and get in their heads, to always advance the story with it, to not go backwards and be like, okay, I told this scene from this person's point of view. So now the next scene, I'm going to tell it from the other person who was in that scene from their point of view. Like, don't do that because you're not moving the story forward. So pick whichever character is the most important character in that scene and have that let them own that scene. So that is just a little tip, but definitely read up on points of view and how to tackle that.
And just on the craft side too, it's
Yeah.
so much easier in screenwriting to see like, oh, different people are speaking. You literally have their name and then their line of dialogue. I say when you're writing your first draft, just stick to he said, she said, so and so character name said. But then when you're going back and editing, I know I'm getting a nitty gritty right now, but read your work out loud and you'll just see how kind of, I don't want to say bad, but just how kind of difficult it is sometimes to realize who's talking or how inundated, like if you're listening to it on an audiobook, the reader might be hearing like he said, she said, she said, she said, she said, like over and over again. And it gets super repetitive. And that's not something you obviously have to worry about with screenwriting. So,
Yeah. Jen said, I thought you could get in different people's heads if it was in different scenes, one person per scene, like in the Game of Thrones books. Yeah, you could even do, I'm not sure if a Game of Thrones does one person per chapter, but you could do in different scenes, just put a little break, even within the same chapter, you could have different points of view as long as you have a little break in those scenes and you're not repeating that stuff.
also, it's the thing with, I feel like screenwriting, there's so many rules. And while there's rules in writing fiction, you can break a lot of them and you can basically do whatever you want. You just have to keep the reader experience in mind. So if you want to jump into a bunch of different people's heads, that's fine, but you just have to consider the reader. And is this going to be a difficult reader experience? But as Jeannie said, if you like break up the scenes with asterisks or however you want to break it up, just to kind of signal to the reader that the perspective is changing, that's just very helpful for the reader experience.
Yeah. And I also find that, when I'm listening to books on audio, it's a different experience than when I'm reading a script, because you're reading a script, you're thinking about there's a very classic kind of structure of a screenplay. And it's the same kind of structure in a book, a little elongated, but you can take more twists and turns. You're not in such a rush. Like you can go a little deeper into the story. And I think that's the beauty of it. And if some of you have never tried writing a book, or even a short story, even if you want to, if a book intimidates you, try to take your script and write it as a short story. We've actually published a couple of short story adaptations of screenplays on Pipeline Artists. And these screenwriters had never written a short story before, and they were fantastic. So you might want to try something like that first, or a novella, or something. Novellas, I think, are a harder sell.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions. It says, is the market different for novellas versus novels? If so, how? I think it's just kind of more common for agents and editors to be requesting full-length novels. Not to say that agents and editors aren't looking for novellas. I just think it might be slightly fewer. It's a little more niche. but there's definitely a place for them. I don't know like too much about the specifics of statistics, but you just have to know kind of where to look for them, I
Yeah.
think.
And also too, I've heard of some screenwriters who take some of their scripts and adapt multiple scripts into short stories and then self-publish short stories compilation book. And that I think is a really interesting marketing idea because you've got all your different screenplays in little short stories in this book that people could
Right.
read. And sometimes people pick up short stories and want those adapted into scripts. And if you already have the screenplay, all that stuff that we said before. Somebody asked about what about Vella on Amazon, feeding it out a few pages at a time. I'm not that, I mean, I know of it. I'm not that familiar. I've never tried it. I don't really
Yeah,
know
same.
anybody who does it, so I couldn't speak to whether it's effective.
Is it a like a self-publishing thing?
I think it is on Amazon. So we don't
Because
know the
that
answer to that question.
yeah. But I can imagine it'd be a great tool. It's kind of like Wattpad, I would assume, where like people would upload their stories and I mean, I'm sure it's very different from Wattpad, but it could be a great way to gain traction for a book if you're like leading up to a release for self-publishing. But again, I don't know too much about that.
So back to like the basics of writing
Adapting.
doing the adaptation. I always call it like a backwards adaptation because you think of it being,
Right.
book to script. You still have to do all that same stuff, the character work, like all of that. Make sure there's evolution, make sure you're rooting for somebody. It's still, like you said, like storytelling is the same, but you might want to consider like, how do I beef this up? How do I make this bigger? How do I get this to 300 pages? There's also different word counts for different genres. So
Yeah.
you want to kind of follow those norms. Like you don't want to write 100,000 word middle grade book. Those are more like sci-fi. So do a little research. It's a quick little Google, search of what's the word count for different genres, and
Mhm.
that'll come up. When you want to lean into it and get deeper, think about maybe subplots. Maybe there's some characters who you thought in your script were really cool and you want to maybe explore them a little bit more. So you can like create this whole other subplot that you couldn't put in the screenplay. Like Ciara was saying earlier, have fun with it. Personally, I think you're going to find it extremely liberating. I loved it so much that I'm like, yeah, I don't think I want to write screenplays anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I think it's you have the space to expand things. So,
Mhm.
especially with subplots, don't even just think of it as like, oh, there was this character I couldn't like spend that much time with. Like now I can do a subplot with it. Think of how that character's subplot could further the main plot and just make it more complex and empowering to the main storyline. I know a lot of times they say that like the subplot should somehow reflect like the protagonist's journey as well, or act as a foil to it. So that's a really great way to kind of just dig deeper into what you want your story to be about and find ways to get your themes across through different
Mhm.
characters. Yeah, you just have a lot more room to kind of have fun with. It's cool.
I'm a big fan of writing with the door shut, as Stephen King says. Like, don't worry about whether you're doing it right. Like if your first draft, you're head hopping, you're getting the POVs wrong, getting the tense wrong in different sections, just get it out, and then go back and you can fix all that after. Like don't get hung up and intimidated, I guess. One thing I did want to say is when we talk about why do this, like why adapt your script into a novel or why, switch over from novel writing to from screenwriting to novel writing, or why try to do both? For me, it's, I think, a question of sanity and survival. The film industry has gotten a little tougher. The strike, I think, has made, shrunk things a little bit. Everybody keeps saying, oh, 2025, things will change. And they might, but why not? If you're a writer, why not write in other mediums? Short stories, comics, graphic novels. We even have some of our pipeline winners and finalists, the script pipeline winners and finalists, who've adapted their work into podcasts. Alex Blumberg, I think he's got something out called Backfires. narrative podcasts are getting bigger. You see them now in film festivals. They're getting awards now. We had on Symposium, we had Jessica Hobbs, who did a narrative podcast. There's another person with a narrative podcast, Heather Taylor. You should look her up. I think their podcast just won an award. She's a screenwriter out of Canada. Just thinking about all the different ways you can tell stories. Because if, just like they say, like if the door shuts, look for an open window, just try different things. Laura asks, I plan on naming each chapter with the character it is about and listing a date or a place if it is all the characters, and title the chapter as current day. It's a 5-person ensemble. And she wants to know if that strategy was confusing. Do you have thoughts on that, Ciara?
I mean, if you have an ensemble cast and you're wanting to be in their different perspectives, I think it's a great idea to break up their perspectives by chapter, if that's what you're saying. If you're saying you're going to do a time and place, so if this is one of those ensemble stories that kind of plays with timeline and does go kind of back and forth, like we're in this time and then we shift to like a year later and then we're going back another year. I think it's a necessity to put like timeline, date, and time under the character heading each chapter so the reader is situated and knows where they are. The structure should reflect something about like what the story is about. So if I'm reading a book that has multiple different characters and you're shifting back and forth through time and there isn't some bigger reason to that, or I don't arrive later in the book at like where all the times collide or like everything kind of falls into pieces or like a big puzzle comes together and I don't really understand why it was told that way, it might take away from the story and what you're actually trying to tell. So I guess on a larger note, just make sure the way you're telling your story, the structure, the formatting, it all lends to your story and what you're trying to achieve with it. And because sometimes those things can come across as gimmicky if they don't aid the story, if they don't have like a purpose.
Yeah, I
I
think
don't
the
know if I
time,
answered that correctly
yeah,
or
the
not,
time
but
jump might be, it depends on how you do that time jump structure wise. That could get confusing. But I've definitely read books where there's a different character for each chapter. And they even write, Jodi Picoult has done this, where I think the book I read, I think she was even, each chapter was written in first person of the character. I'm not as big of a fan of first person, but it seems to be more and more common.
I love first person.
Do you? I'm not I like to see the whole world a little bit. I like what is it, third person omniscient, where you've got the
Oh,
whole world, but it's still, the emphasis is on one character. So you can still get outside that, you can still watch that character, but you're kind of in that character. Like see what I mean? The POV can be very complicated and
yes.
it can be
I
very
understand.
intimidating.
I
But
understand the appeal, but I also love just getting to be, I think maybe it's because I came from screenwriting and you aren't supposed to do like internal thoughts
yeah.
unless it's like a voiceover, but I just love getting inside the character's head. And that doesn't mean you can't, obviously, if the entire book is from one person's perspective, you have to stick with that. But if you're doing like an ensemble cast and you have different chapters dedicated to different characters, you can still see
Yeah.
the world from different perspectives, but you still get to kind of dig deeper, a little deeper into that character, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. And also too, there's certain genres that first person is more popular for, like romance.
Similarly to what I was saying before about structure and formatting and how that should all aid what your story is about, your perspective and the tense you're telling the story in, same thing. You should think about all those things. Like how would writing a story in first person, like being really close to this one character's mind, how would that better your story? Or if your story would be better served from a little more disconnect, or if you want to reveal or have a twist, sometimes that little bit of a disconnect using third person is more advantageous. So you have to sort of think about your story as a whole with every element of your writing.
Yeah. Jen has an interesting question. I recently adapted an award-winning screenplay into a novel. I got beta readers and used their feedback, etc. Now it's ready to be published, but I'm terrified to put it on Amazon. It feels so final. With a screenplay, you can enter it into competitions and know that it's just one version, but this feels different. How do you get over that? Can you go back and edit it once it's published? I think this is more of a question of if you're self-publishing it versus if you
Yeah.
want to try to traditionally publish. And publishing is a whole other conversation, but we could definitely touch on that.
Yeah, if you want to self-publish, I think it's you can if you feel good about it and it's ready to go, you can publish it. And then if like afterwards you're like, oh my God, I found a mistake, or oh, I just thought of a way to make the ending pop or something, be much better, then you can unpublish it or you can and do like a second edition where you make those changes and improvements. Um, Traditional publishing, that's definitely a bit more difficult to do, but if you're traditional publishing, it's going through so many different hands that it will be ready and you just have to let it go. At least that's what I believe to be true.
But what I love about novel writing is that you can self-publish, and it's not like when you go and make an indie film, it costs so much money. Self-publishing a book, like we have a fantastic symposium that it goes deep into self-publishing. Karen Richardson taught it, and it's so good. And it's totally doable. But then you also have to be your own marketer, your own PR
Right.
team, and all that. But honestly, if you're traditionally published, you still have to do all that stuff as well.
Hmm.
The traditional publishers don't give authors as much help as they used to. So self-publishing is definitely something that people should consider. And you don't have to share the profits with it.
That's true.
I'm
And
sure
especially,
Amazon takes something, but
well, especially with social media and it just being
Mhm.
so accessible to everyone and being able to market your own work is so much easier now than it really ever has been. So that's definitely a perk.
Kaylin asked if anybody publishes the script just as a script. You could. I don't know what kind of audience is going to be there to read it as much. I've
Yeah.
seen there was some company that was doing it, but I don't know that it really took off. I think you're better off taking this screenplay and writing it as a novella and self-publishing it.
Well, especially because I think a lot of times, like if people are selling screenplays, they're of movies that have already been made, and it's like, oh, buy the screenplay of it, and you can kind of have it as a collector's item or something like that. But just yeah,
In screenwriting, we people use Final Draft or Fade In or different kinds of software. What kind of there's options for the novel space. What do you typically write your novels in?
I write my novels in Scrivener. It's not like the most eloquent software, but writing a whole massive book in one Word document is just like too much for me. Like, because you're constantly going back and forth. So I use Scrivener, which is really great because it allows you to break up all your documents. I always break them up by chapter. So you have like a chapter folder, and then you can add scenes underneath it. So I'll do like chapter one, scene two, and then you can compile it all at the end. And there's also these cute little note cards for each like chapter or scene that you can put notes you want to have to reference, or like just I usually put a little summary of what happens in the chapter. So then when I'm like, oh, I need to go back and change this thing and I don't remember where it is, I don't have to go through the whole thing. I just go to the little note card. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the chapter it's in. So it's just very, very helpful. I highly recommend it.
And it's very inexpensive.
Yeah, it's like what, $40, $50 just to
Yeah,
a one-time purchase.
it's really good. And they do have note cards. They have all different features. I know Final
Mhm.
Draft does have a novel template. I've never tried it. A lot of writers also just use Word, double space. Scriveners can be very overwhelming. It's one of those things that like you think about your cell phone, there's probably a whole bunch of features on your phone you've never even used, right? Same
Yeah.
thing with Scrivener. There's like so many bells and whistles that it's really can be very intimidating. I actually just pulled mine up the other day because I'm getting back to writing and I was like, okay, I'm
Yay.
going to pull it up. and I felt like I needed to learn it all over again. But there are a ton of videos on YouTube about how to use Scrivener. Go look those up and just watch them. And there's even, I think, probably on the Scrivener site, they probably have some demo videos that you could watch to see if you like it. But it's so cheap.
You also
Get
don't
into it.
have to use like all the different bells and whistles. I
Right.
have barely scratched the surface on what I use for it.
Yeah.
And I still
Same.
find it super helpful. But yeah, that would definitely be my recommendation. One of the questions is, can we dump directly from Final Draft into Scrivener?
I'm not sure what kind of files you can export out of Final Draft. I know with Scrivener, one other thing I wanted to mention about that is when you submit to an agent, so say you want to get a literary agent, you can't send them a Scrivener file. You have to, they usually want stuff in Word or PDF or whatever, but you can export your Scrivener that way. You can even click off those. So say you wrote some chapters, you're like, oh, I'm not going to use those, but I didn't want to delete them. You can just tag all the chapters you want to compile into a thing, to one document, and leave a couple out if you want to. There's a lot of stuff you can do. Do you know a Final Draft you can export? I can't remember.
I think you can export into Word and then you could.
This isn't a tech pro.
Yeah, I'm not too sure, but also I'm not sure why you would, if you wrote a novel in Final Draft, if that's what you're asking.
Even if you just copy and paste, like select all and paste it in. Because the nicest
Yeah.
thing about the screenplay, adapting a screenplay into a novel, is that you already have your outline. So you're never looking at a blank page. You've got
Right.
it. So you stick it in there and then you write it like it's in
It's
more
like,
novel form.
yeah, it's like filling in the blanks a little bit. It's just like expanding upon the spine of your story, essentially.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
I just popped over to look at the chat and someone said my friend turned 80 and self-published all of her scripts on Amazon. Happy
Cool.
birthday. That's awesome. Can you suggest any legitimate self-publishing companies? Is Amazon self-publishing legitimate? Amazon is, it's really probably how most people self-publish.
Yeah, it's like the go-to. It's like the industry
Yeah.
standard. I think there's like third-party print places you can use, but
Yes.
they're probably a bit
The
more
names are
expensive.
escaping me.
But Amazon is like, that's if you want to self-publish your book, that's at least where you would start, I'd say.
So somebody says that it accepts Final Draft files in the import menu option list. Look at that. It's like we've turned into teaching a session about Scrivener.
I don't know how much we're teaching.
We're
We're
not
sort of like,
teaching.
we
We're
like
just
it,
kind of,
and they're like, this is how
we
you
like
can
it.
actually do it. And we're like,
Yeah,
oh, I think I'm learning more about Scrivener from the
exactly.
chat.
Exactly. And there's also print on demand. So like if you self-publish, it's going to be an ebook. Self-publishing is a whole other topic. But again, we have a fantastic, let me see if I can find it. I'm going to make Ciara talk for a second while I find the link to this, because this is the most comprehensive self-published session I've ever viewed and participated in. And it goes into all these self-publishing questions. So I just want to, but
Well, while Jeannie's looking for that, if you don't want to go down the self-publishing route, if you want to try to go
yes.
traditional publishing, it's a pretty straightforward process. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of you already know about it, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit anyways. If you basically research what agents you want to submit to, and similar to screenwriting, you see what kind of genres they represent, what they're looking for. Every agent has different submission requirements, so you just make sure that you're following their specific submission requirements. You're going to have to write a query letter. You might have to write a synopsis, and then they usually ask for like the first. Again, every agent's different. It might be first chapter, first 3 chapters, first 50 pages. And so you just individually have to send them the specified what they're asking for specifically. And then waiting is very different for each agent. There's some agents who will get back to you super quickly, and then there's other agents where you might have to wait a month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 before they even request more chapters or the full manuscript or reject you. just like screenwriting, there's a lot of rejection.
Yeah, I'd like to hear your impression of the publishing market for screenwriters. It seems like there must be a flood of screenwriters adapting screenplays to novels. I'm talking about traditional publishers.
I know that there's like a very niche place where it's like people who make movies are like, if a movie is made, they then can hire someone to write the novelized version. That's very niche and I think probably very difficult to get into. But just in general, I would imagine that because similar to what I said earlier about it being the film industry being a little bit more difficult to get into, and not even just like get your script in front of someone to read, but to get a film actually made, whereas it's far less complicated to get your book published. So I'd imagine there's tons of screenwriters who feel kind of fed up with the state of the industry, or at the very least want to try a different form to get their stories out there. But when it comes to like collecting data on that, I don't know if there's really a way to know that, because if you're trying to get your work published, even if you come from screenwriting, you still have to go through kind of the same process as everyone else, unless obviously you have like connections in the publishing industry and stuff like that. But
So basically, let's just touch on quickly on that process. So you're basically going to query, if you want to do traditional publishing, you're going to query an agent. Hopefully, they'll ask for sample or a full manuscript and they'll review. It's going to take a while, so you have to be very patient. And then you'll hear back. Sometimes you'll just get a form response that says, yeah, it's not for us, but thank you for submitting. Other times they might be like, I really love this. And they might give you some guidance and tell you to revise and resubmit. And so then you go and make the changes if you agree with them, and then resubmit and try again. And that might lead to something. But once you get repped, then you're going to work with not just the agent, but the agent's then going to try to find you a publisher, and that publisher, there'll be an editor. All the publishing houses have an acquiring editor, and that editor will have a conversation with you and decide, yes, I want to pick up this book. Then that editor has to go pitch your book to the publishers to see if they want to buy it. And they give you an advance, say they want to buy it, everybody's happy, they give you an advance. It's not going to be a lot, so but it's okay. It's something. Adjust your expectations. And then you're going to work with that editor to get the book ready. And sometimes you'll be able to have some sort of feedback with what the book cover looks like. Sometimes you're not going to have any say in what the book cover looks like. Off it goes when they say it's ready and it gets published. And it takes, how long does it take, Ciara, from on the average, from when somebody's book gets picked up by a publisher? Yes, we want to publish this. Is it like 2 years?
I'd say minimum like a year and a half, because they're scheduled so far out, like they have their own rosters. So it'd be really rare if they were like, great, we're going to buy this book and it'll be out next month. Like that might happen in an indie publisher, but not one of the bigger traditional publishers. So yeah, I'd say probably more average, closer to 2 years. It also depends on the book, on how much editing it needs to go, on the writer's pace of their writing and editing. So sometimes it's a bit more individualized. I did see a question about needing to go through an agent. Do we need to go through an agent? Because I have contacted a publisher directly ages ago and they responded. So most of the big publishers are usually don't accept unsolicited queries. They usually only accept them from agent writers, because they know if the writer has an agent, they've essentially been vetted and they're not, I don't want to say wasting their time, but they're not wasting their time with this massive slush pile if they were just open to anyone who wants to send them a book. There are some different imprints at bigger publishers that don't require agents. There's also larger independent presses that you don't need agents to submit to, But for the most part, your best bet into getting a decent deal is to go through an agent. Also, if you have like a personal connection, if you know an editor in a big traditional publishing house, that might allow you to skip the agent phase.
Mhm.
But I would say it's still always good to have an agent because, say, those do go to negotiations, they want to buy your book, your agent will be able to go over those contracts with you and advocate for you and know the business probably a bit better than you do. So
And get
that's
you a
what I'm saying.
better deal.
Right.
That's the advantage of having one. You do have to pay the agent like 20%. They'll typically get you more money than you would have gotten. So that would cover the 20%,
Right.
if you didn't have the agent. Can you share some books adapted from screenplays that you think are strong examples? Would love to find some existing works to reference. These any screenplay that a book is adapted would be a spec script. So we wouldn't necessarily know that it was a script first,
Yeah.
and the script wouldn't be publicly out there. I will
There's
tell
tons of
you,
examples of the other way around.
yeah, yes. How to add a lot more outside dialogue to change it to a novel, and how to add more visual elements to your screenplay.
So I think you're saying like rather than just writing dialogue, like how can you expand? Because screenplays
The
can be so heavily
descriptions.
focused on um, dialogue. I think it also goes back to like what point of view you decide to tell the story in, because say you're writing in first person, you might not just have dialogue and description, but you can kind of go down the path of their like inner thought of like what are they thinking within a scene, what perspective do they have on what's unfolding on the page, and then kind of play with the reader's expectations that way of maybe like what they're thinking versus what they're saying in dialogue. And then, yeah, just in general, just painting the scene. In screenwriting, it can be a bit easier because you can be like, because you kind of write to production. And if you're writing, say, like, oh, they're in a movie theater or whatever, you don't necessarily have to describe what the movie theater looks like because you won't know kind of where they'll be shooting the script and you just know it's a movie theater. Whereas in a novel, you need to really describe the space and allow the reader to be able to paint a picture of it in their head. And that fills up a lot of space.
It can, especially if it's like there's something special and unique about the theater. Like think about like that visceral experience you have when you go into a theater. Like what are the smells? What are all the things you're not allowed to
Yeah.
write about in scripts because it just bloats the screenplay.
Utilize the five senses.
Yes. Somebody asked a question over in the chat side, and I think this is an important one, wanting to know if it was free to submit novels for querying like a small publisher. And yes, you should
Yeah.
not ever pay to query.
If you're getting asked to pay to query something or paying someone to publish your book, it's probably a bit of a scam. I know there's like some hybrid publishers, but basically people shouldn't get paid unless you're getting paid. That's how it works. We are just about out of time,
Oh my
but
gosh, that went fast.
I know really
So
fast.
really fast. So yes, somebody just mentioned this. Oh, I'm so glad you did. Writer Beware is a site that lists all the writing scams, and
Mhm.
on Symposium. Oh, let me drop the link because this one is free, kids. I am doing a one-on-one with Victoria Strauss, who is the woman behind Writer Beware. I just dropped a link. You can register for it. It doesn't cost you a thing.
One more question saying, can you
Yep.
point us to a good source for a sample query email? You can find samples of these like all over the internet. I know Jane Friedman does
Yep.
really good ones, but also quick plug for us at Book Pipeline, we offer editorial services. So you can send us your query letter if you want, and we will give you an evaluation on it and help make it
Yeah.
the best it can be.
Yes. And I also want to say, because we talked about Bella earlier, and Ciara and I know nothing about Bella, somebody had posted that Bella is going away in February 2025. So don't bother. Let
Okay,
that
good. I feel
go.
I feel less bad about not knowing about it.
Yes. And then somebody else pointed out, talking about Amazon and where to self-publish, she said she does Amazon, and she also said draft to digital, draft to with the number 2 digital. I self-publish on Amazon and then use draft to digital, and they distribute my books to many other outlets. So
amazing.
Yes, so that's another great resource.
Thank you
Sweet.
for that.
Thank you guys very much. And I guess that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. If you guys ever have any questions, we can be reached at info@bookpipeline.com.
The Story Will Save You is a Pipeline Artists original podcast. Like, subscribe, and follow us on social media at Pipeline Artists and at Book Pipeline. For more information, visit pipelineartist.com and bookpipeline.com, where we have contests for unpublished manuscripts as well as for published books that would make great adaptations for either film or television. Learn more about our efforts to help writers find publishing success on bookpipeline.com. Until next time, let the story save you.